when a being from beyond the stars falls into a war not her own, carrying strength that bends the very fabric of the Force, the galaxy must ask itself a question it has never faced. She can shatter star destroyers with her hands, survive the void without armor, and move faster than blaster bolts can track. The Empire will hunt her. The Sith will try to twist her, and the rebellion will look to her as salvation they never earned. But there is a darkness in being powerful enough to save everyone, a temptation that whispers you should rule the very people you came to protect. In a universe where hope is dying and tyrants command the stars, what happens when the most dangerous thing is not the enemy's fleet, but the hero who could win the war alone? The Outer Rim held secrets the core worlds would never understand. Beyond the civilized sectors where senatorial fleets maintained order and hyperspace lanes hummed with commercial traffic, beyond even the contested territories where Republic and Separatist forces clashed in their endless dance of ideology and ambition, there existed worlds forgotten by cartographers and ignored by conquerors. Worlds where the Force moved in patterns older than the Jedi Temple itself, where ancient stone circles marked convergences of power that predated the first lightsaber, where the galaxy's memory ran deep as ocean trenches and twice as dark. On one such world, a moon called Vehar, that orbited a gas giant in a nameless system, the sky tore open on a night when 3 moons aligned, and the local primitives sang their songs of ending and becoming. What fell from that rupture in space was not a meteor or a derelict ship tumbling from a lost battle. What fell was fire wrapped in purpose, a capsule of silver metal that burned through atmosphere like a prophet's warning, trailing plasma and impossible light. It struck the crystalline plains with force enough to shatter the surrounding formations into glittering dust, and when the smoke cleared and the natives approached with their spears of carved bone and their prayers of warding, they found within the crater something that should not exist. A young woman, golden-haired and dressed in colors that had no name in their language, floating a hand's breadth above the scorched ground while unconscious. Around her, the Force screamed. The disturbance rippled outward through the galaxy's hidden currents, touching sensitive minds in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, where masters paused mid-meditation with expressions of confusion and concern. It brushed against Sith lords in their fortresses of solitude, causing them to grip armrests with sudden hunger. It resonated in the scattered enclaves of Force-sensitive orders that owed allegiance to neither light nor dark, the witches of Dathomir and the monks of the Wills, the scattered guardians of the breath, who maintained their vigils on forgotten temple worlds. Something new had entered the pattern, something that carried the Force within it but had never known the Force, like a lens that bends light without understanding illumination, like a vessel carved to hold wine that has never tasted the grape. The Knights of Ren felt it most acutely. On their mobile fortress, a reclaimed star destroyer rechristened the Knight's Heart that drifted through the unknown regions following currents of dark side energy. The 7 warriors who served a master older than their current incarnations had been conferring when the disturbance struck. They were not Sith, though they drew from similar wells. They were not Jedi, though some had trained in those halls before choosing a different path. They were seekers of power in its rawest form, believers in strength as the ultimate arbiter of truth, collectors of artifacts and knowledge that the galaxy's major Force traditions had deemed too dangerous or too heretical to preserve. Their masks, each unique and terrible, turned as one toward the direction of Vehar, though none of them could have named the moon or found it on any chart. Their leader, who wore a mask like a screaming void and bore a name that changed with each generation of knights, spoke in a voice that carried the weight of crushed worlds. The prophecy fragment from the Malachor texts, the one we could not decipher. The knight beside him, masked in silver like captured starlight, nodded slowly. The carrier, the one who brings the storm without knowing the wind. Find it, the leader commanded. Before the Jedi, before the Sith, whatever has arrived belongs to us. The Knight's Heart altered course, its hyperdrive spooling with a sound like distant screaming. Kara Zor-El woke to pain that should have been impossible. Her invulnerable body, which had withstood the destruction of Krypton itself during her escape, which had endured the radiation of a dozen dying stars during her pod's drift through the cosmos, ached as though every cell was remembering how to exist. She opened her eyes to a sky that was wrong, 3 moons where Earth had possessed one, and colors in the atmosphere that spoke of different gases, different star temperatures, different laws of nature applying their pressure. She tried to sit up and found the action more difficult than it should have been, as though gravity here exerted a pull that varied from moment to moment, increasing and decreasing according to rhythms she could not predict. Around her, the natives watched with eyes that reflected more intelligence than their primitive tools suggested. They did not attack, they did not approach, they simply watched as she rose, as she tested her limbs and found them functional if weakened, as she surveyed the crater her arrival had created and understood that she had once again survived the unsurvivable. But something was different here. The sun that rose over the horizon, a yellow star smaller and somehow angrier than Sol, bathed her in light that she absorbed as always. But the energy that filled her cells felt polluted, mixed with something else, something that pulsed and flowed according to rules that had nothing to do with electromagnetic radiation. One of the natives, an elder with markings scarred into flesh the color of ash, approached slowly. He held no weapon. He held no offering. He simply raised both hands, palms out, and spoke in a language Kara did not recognize. But somehow, impossibly, she understood the meaning beneath the words. The Bright One has arrived. The balance is broken. The storm walks in woman's form. Kara opened her mouth to respond, to ask where she was and how she might find a way home. But before she could speak, the elder's eyes went wide. He looked past her, toward the sky, and every native suddenly scattered, running for the crystalline formations that ringed the plain, disappearing into caves and crevices with the practiced efficiency of prey that knows the predator's hunting patterns. Kara turned and saw the ships descending. They were angular, aggressive, black as the space between stars, and adorned with symbols that spoke of ideologies she could not parse. 5 craft, each different in configuration but unified in purpose, dropping through the atmosphere with weapon systems powering up. She could hear the energy building in their cannon arrays with her super hearing, could see the targeting systems locking onto her position through hull-mounted sensor clusters. They were not exploratory vessels, they were not diplomatic envoys, they were killers, coming for her with professional intent. Kara lifted off the ground, rising to meet them, and felt something surge through her that was not merely the yellow sun's gift. It was as though the air itself was alive, responsive to intention and emotion, flowing through her and around her in currents that made her skin prickle. She did not have time to analyze the sensation. The ships opened fire, and the crystalline plane erupted in plasma and concussive force. She moved between the blasts with speed that blurred her form into streaks of red and blue, dodging attacks that would have vaporized a normal human. But here, weakened by this galaxy's strange physics and the unfamiliar energy that saturated everything, she found herself working harder than she should have needed to. One blast clipped her shoulder, and the pain was real, immediate, a sensation she had not felt since childhood on Krypton. She gritted her teeth and accelerated upward, closing the distance to the nearest ship in a heartbeat, and drove her fist through its hull with force that sent tremors through the entire craft. The vessel lurched, systems failing, and began a slow spiral toward the ground. But the other 4 adjusted immediately, their formations tightening, their firing patterns coordinating with the precision of experienced hunters. They were not trying to destroy her, she realized. They were trying to drive her, to herd her toward something, and when she glanced down, she saw figures emerging from one of the landed craft, 7 warriors in armor and masks, who moved with a grace that spoke of augmented reflexes and years of combat training. The Knights of Ren had arrived to claim their prize. Kara descended to face them because she would not run from a fight, because the part of her that was Kryptonian nobility and the part that was El family pride would not permit retreat, and because something in the energy that flowed through this place sang to the core of her being with a resonance that felt like recognition. She touched down 20 meters from the knights, fists clenched, cape settling around her shoulders like a banner of defiance. The leader stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried across the plain despite the wind and the crackling energy of cooling plasma. "You are the carrier, the prophecy made flesh. Come with us willingly and you will be elevated. Resist and you will still come, but the galaxy will suffer for your pride." Kara's jaw tightened. She had heard threats before, on Earth, from warlords and conquerors and megalomaniacs who believed their power gave them the right to dictate terms to others. She had learned that such men understood only one language, and she was fluent in its grammar. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but I'm not going anywhere until someone explains where I am and how I get home." The knight in the silver mask laughed, a sound like ice cracking over deep water. "Home? You crash onto a Nexus world riding a wave of force energy that has not been seen since the days of the Celestials, and you speak of home? You are home. This is where you were always meant to arrive." The word caught Kara's attention despite her wariness. Force. The natives had not used it, but it hung in the air now with weight and meaning, and the energy that flowed through everything suddenly had a name. She could feel it responding to the knights, bending around them like water around stones, and she realized with creeping unease that whatever power they possessed was connected to this force, and that her presence was affecting it in ways she did not understand. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not from this galaxy. I'm trying to find my way back to Earth." The leader tilted his masked head as though considering an insect's declaration of sovereignty. "Earth. A myth. A name from dead languages. It does not matter. What matters is what you are, what you carry. You radiate force energy like a star radiates light, but you do not channel it, do not shape it, do not even perceive it. You are raw potential, untempered, unclaimed. We will teach you. We will show you how to reshape reality with a thought, how to bend wills and break armies, how to become what you were meant to be." Kara's eyes hardened. "I already know what I'm meant to be, and it's not this." The leader made a gesture, and the 6 other knights moved as one, spreading into an attack formation with the synchronization of predators who had hunted together for years. Kara tensed, but before combat could be joined, before the first blow could be struck, the sky tore open a second time, not with fire and metal, but with light. A ship dropped from hyperspace directly above the plane. A blockade runner painted white and bearing the sigil of the Rebel Alliance, its ion engines screaming as it executed a combat descent that should have torn it apart, but somehow held together through what could only have been exceptional piloting. It leveled off 10 meters above the ground, and its boarding ramp dropped even as the ship maintained speed, and a figure leaped from that ramp with a cable gun in one hand and a blaster in the other. Princess Leia Organa hit the crystalline ground in a roll that transferred momentum into a sprint, her weapon already tracking toward the Knights of Ren with the precision of someone who had survived 100 battlefields and intended to survive 100 more. Behind her, rebel commandos were following, establishing a perimeter, laying down suppressing fire that forced the knights to scatter their formation. Leia's voice cut across the chaos with royal authority and military command perfectly balanced. "Whoever you are, if you want to live, you're coming with us now." Kara stared at this new arrival, at the determination in the woman's dark eyes, at the way she moved like someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. She glanced at the Knights of Ren, who were regrouping despite the rebel fire, and made a decision based on instinct and the simple fact that Leia had asked rather than demanded. She flew. The distance between her position and Leia's closed in a blur of motion that made the princess's eyes widen, and before the knights could react, Kara had scooped Leia into her arms and launched skyward, accelerating toward the hovering ship with speed that left sonic booms rippling across the plain. The rebel commandos were already retreating, laying down thermal charges to cover their withdrawal, and the ship's gunners opened up with everything they had to keep the knights suppressed. Kara carried Leia through the open boarding ramp and set her down with care that belied the violence of their departure. Around them, rebels were securing the ship, the pilot was already banking hard and climbing for orbit, and the whole vessel shook as something massive exploded below, the thermal charges doing their work. Leia straightened her clothing with dignity that refused to acknowledge she had just been plucked from a battlefield by a flying woman in a cape, and extended her hand. "Princess Leia Organa of Alderaan, General of the Rebel Alliance." Welcome to a galaxy at war. Kara took the offered hand, noting the strength in the grip, the calluses that spoke of blaster training and hard living. Kara Zor-El, and I didn't mean to crash your war. I was trying to get home. Leia's expression softened fractionally, though her eyes remained sharp, assessing. Then we have something in common. We're all trying to get home. It's just that the Empire keeps destroying them. The ship shuddered as it broke atmosphere, and through the viewport Kara could see the black vessels of the Knights of Ren in pursuit, their weapon systems lighting up the darkness with lances of crimson energy. The pilot, a Duros with reflexes faster than human baseline, was weaving through the incoming fire with skill that bordered on prescient, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Leia moved to the communications station with the confidence of someone who had commanded from worse positions. All power to rear shields. Prepare for jump to hyperspace on my mark. But before the command could be executed, Kara made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. She moved to the boarding ramp, slapped the emergency release, and stepped out into vacuum before anyone could stop her. The void embraced her like a lover's touch. She did not need to breathe. Her Kryptonian physiology, designed by evolution and genetic engineering to survive in the harshest environments Krypton's savage history could produce, simply adjusted, her cells extracting energy directly from the distant stars and the ambient radiation that filled the space between worlds. Below her, Vehar's 3 moons gleamed with reflected light. Above her, the gas giant dominated the sky like a god's marble eye, and arrayed before her, the pursuing ships of the Knights of Ren were accelerating, closing the distance, preparing to fire. Kara flew to meet them. She accelerated faster than their targeting computers could track, faster than their pilots could compensate, becoming a streak of color against the black that intersected with the lead vessel in a collision that was not a collision but a penetration. She punched through the hull, through the corridors, through bulkheads and power conduits and whatever crew members were unfortunate enough to be in her path, and emerged from the opposite side, with metal fragments trailing behind her like shed skin. The ship listed, atmosphere venting, and began to tumble. The other vessels scattered, their formations breaking, and Kara understood in that moment that she had just demonstrated something they had not expected. Power. Yes, they had known she possessed power, but the willingness to use it, the capacity for controlled violence, the warrior's understanding of how to end threats permanently and without hesitation, that they had not anticipated. She returned to the rebel ship through the still-open boarding ramp and found Leia waiting with an expression that mixed respect with concern and something that might have been recognition. "You fight like someone who has lost too much to ever lose again." Kara met her eyes and said nothing, because it was true. Because Krypton was ashes and her family was memory and Earth was impossibly far away, perhaps in another reality entirely, and she was tired of losing. The ship jumped to hyperspace, the stars stretching into lines of blue-white fire, and the Knights of Ren were left behind in the Vehar system to contemplate what they had found and what it might mean for the galaxy's precarious balance. In the ship's small medical bay, Leia tended to the minor injuries Kara had sustained, burns from plasma fire that were already healing at a rate that made the princess pause. They spoke in the careful manner of strangers who recognize in each other something familiar, something kindred, the shared understanding of those who carry responsibilities too heavy and destinies too large. "The Knights of Ren are not our primary enemy," Leia explained, applying Bacta with efficient movements. "They're scavengers, treasure hunters who follow Force legends and try to collect power for their own purposes. Dangerous, but not organized enough to threaten the rebellion directly. Our real enemy is the Empire, Palpatine's regime. They control most of the galaxy, maintain order through fear and military might, and destroy anyone who stands against them." Kara absorbed this information, mapping it against her knowledge of Earth's history, finding uncomfortable parallels. "And you're fighting them. We're trying to survive them. Fighting implies we have resources comparable to theirs. We don't. What we have is hope, determination, and the knowledge that tyranny eventually collapses under its own weight if you can just outlast it." The word hope resonated in Kara's chest, and she recognized it as the same quality that had driven her to become a hero on Earth, the same quality that had made her believe she could honor Krypton's memory by protecting her adopted world. But here, in this galaxy where the energy called the Force flowed through everything and nothing made sense according to the physics she knew, what did hope mean? What could one person do, no matter how powerful, against an empire that controlled entire star systems? The Force, Kara said, changing subjects but not really. The Knights kept talking about it. What is it? Leia was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling in their work. When she spoke, her voice carried layers of meaning that spoke of personal history and complicated legacies. The Force is what gives certain people their power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, penetrates us, binds the galaxy together. The Jedi were its guardians once, before the Empire. They used the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack, never for aggression. But the Sith used it differently. They believed in strength, in domination, in reshaping reality according to their will. The Emperor is Sith. His enforcer, Darth Vader, is Sith. They've nearly exterminated the Jedi and anyone else who might challenge their understanding of what the Force should be. Kara considered this, feeling again that strange resonance in her cells, that sense of connection to something vast and alive that permeated this galaxy. And you? Do you use the Force? Leia's smile was small and complicated. I have the potential, the bloodline. But I've never trained, never had the time or the teachers. I feel it sometimes, in moments of danger, like an instinct that tells me where to move or what decision to make. But I don't control it. I just trust it when it speaks. She finished applying the Bacta and stepped back, studying Kara with an expression that mixed assessment with something deeper, a recognition of kindred isolation. The Knights weren't wrong about you, you know. I can feel it even without training. You're like a sun in the Force, radiating energy that doesn't fit the normal patterns. I don't know what that means, but I know the Empire will want to control it, the Jedi will want to study it, and the Sith will want to corrupt it. You need to decide what you want before any of them make that decision for you. Kara stood, testing her body, finding it mostly restored despite the strangeness of this galaxy's healing rhythms. What I want is to go home. But until I figure out how, I'm not going to hide. If there are people suffering under this empire, if there are innocents being hurt, then I help. That's who I am. Leia's expression shifted into something that might have been approval or might have been sorrow. Then you're already doomed, because this galaxy has more suffering than any one person can heal, and trying will break you. Maybe. But I have to try. The princess nodded slowly, as though hearing an echo of words she had spoken to herself 1,000 times. Then I suppose we're allies, for now, until you realize the cost or until the Empire finds us, whichever comes first. The ship dropped from hyperspace near a moon designated only by stellar coordinates, a barren rock orbiting a dead world in a sector that no longer appeared on Imperial charts. The rebel base here was small, temporary, a handful of prefabricated structures and concealed sensor arrays maintained by 24 personnel who lived with the knowledge that discovery meant death. They had chosen this isolation deliberately, operating beyond the Empire's reach and attention, running small operations that chipped away at Imperial supply lines and communications without drawing the eye of star destroyers or the interest of Moffs. Kara descended the boarding ramp into a world of muted colors and exhausted faces, of people who wore their resistance like armor that was slowly crushing them beneath its weight. They watched her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to something that looked dangerously like worship, and she understood immediately that her arrival would complicate their carefully balanced existence. The base commander, a Bothan named Trial, with fur the color of rust and eyes that had seen too many operations go wrong, approached Leia with respect that edged toward affection. "Princess, your message said you'd found something important. I didn't realize you meant someone capable of flying through the void without a suit." Leia gestured to Kara. "Commander Trial, this is Kara Zor-El. She crashed on Vihar yesterday, and the Knights of Ren tried to claim her. Her abilities are unlike anything we've encountered. Enhanced strength, flight, apparent invulnerability to most conventional weapons, and she radiates Force energy in a way that neither the Jedi archives nor Sith texts have described. Triel's eyes narrowed, his strategic mind already processing implications. How enhanced. Kara, uncomfortable with being discussed like a weapon, spoke before Leia could answer. Strong enough to punch through starship hulls, fast enough to dodge blaster fire at close range, durable enough that it takes sustained plasma bombardment to injure me, and even then, I heal quickly. She paused, then added with complete honesty, "On my home world, I was considered one of the most powerful beings on the planet. Here, I don't know what my limits are. Everything feels different, weaker in some ways, stronger in others." The Bothan's fur rippled in a pattern that Kara's enhanced vision could not interpret, but Leia clearly understood. The princess placed a hand on Triel's shoulder with gentle warning. "She's not a weapon we can aim, Commander. She's a refugee who wants to help until she finds her way home. We provide her with information about the Empire and assistance with her search. In return, she assists with operations when her abilities are appropriate. That's the arrangement." Triel looked between them, calculating, and finally nodded with the resignation of someone who has learned that arguing with Leia Organa rarely produces desired results. "Very well, but the moment this draws Imperial attention we can't handle, we evacuate. This base is too small to stand against Star Destroyers, and I won't sacrifice my people because we sheltered someone who shines in the Force like a hyperdrive malfunction." The metaphor was colorful, and Kara almost smiled despite the tension. "I understand. I'll try not to shine too brightly." The following days established a rhythm that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. Kara learned about the galaxy's basic structure, its history of Republic and Empire, its complex web of species and cultures and conflicting ideologies that made Earth's divisions seem almost quaint by comparison. She learned about hyperspace, travel, and blaster technology, about the clone wars that had ended just 2 decades prior and reshaped the galaxy's political landscape, about the Jedi purge that had followed, and the terrible efficiency with which Palpatine had consolidated power. She learned about the Force through observation rather than instruction, watching the few Force-sensitive rebels who passed through the base as they meditated or practiced basic techniques, passed down through oral tradition rather than formal training. They moved with a centeredness she recognized from watching monks on Earth. But there was something more here, a genuine connection to the energy that flowed through all things, and when she tried to replicate their meditative states, she found herself overwhelmed by sensations that had no names in Kryptonian or English. The Force did not speak to her the way it spoke to those born and raised in this galaxy. It crashed against her like waves against cliffs, powerful and persistent, but unable to erode what she fundamentally was, and yet, impossibly, she was changing it. The rebels who could sense such things reported that the energy patterns around the base had shifted since her arrival, becoming more intense, more chaotic, as though her presence was amplifying everything Force-related in her vicinity. Leia found her one evening on the observation platform that overlooked the dead world below, a place where personnel came to remember why they fought and what they were trying to preserve. "You're frustrated." Kara did not turn, her eyes fixed on the lifeless surface below. "I can hear your heartbeat from here. Did you know that? Your pulse, your breathing, the electrical signals in your nervous system. On Earth, I learned to filter it out, to focus on what mattered. But here, with this Force energy everywhere, it's like everything is amplified. I hear the whole base, feel the whole moon, and I don't know how to process it." Leia moved to stand beside her, close enough to be companionable but far enough to respect the alien nature of Kara's senses. The Jedi trained from childhood to control their connection to the Force. They had centuries of accumulated knowledge, techniques passed from master to apprentice, rituals that helped them find balance. You're trying to do it alone, without guidance, while also processing grief and displacement. Of course, you're overwhelmed. I just want to help. That's all I've ever wanted, to use what I can do to make things better. But here, I don't know the rules. I don't know if helping will make things worse. Those knights said I was breaking some kind of balance just by existing. The Knights of Ren believe in strength as a moral absolute. Their opinion on balance is irrelevant. Leia was quiet for a moment, choosing words with care. There's someone I think you should meet. A Jedi, one of the last. He's been hiding since the Purge, training my brother in secret, and he might be able to help you understand what's happening to you. But finding him means leaving this base, traveling to a system that's under Imperial scrutiny, and risking exposure. Kara turned to face her, noting the tension in Leia's posture, the weight of the decision she was presenting. Your brother is training to be a Jedi. Was training. The Death Star destroyed Alderaan 3 months ago. My entire world, billions of people, erased in an instant to demonstrate Imperial power. My brother joined the rebellion after that, fought at Yavin, helped destroy the Death Star in retaliation. But his training is incomplete, and without guidance, he's vulnerable to the dark side, to becoming what he fights against. The pain in Leia's voice was raw despite her attempt to maintain composure, and Kara understood in that moment that the princess carried losses as profound as her own. Worlds unmade, families scattered, homes reduced to memory. What's his name? Luke. Luke Skywalker. Leia paused, then added with a small smile. He's reckless, optimistic, and convinced he can save the galaxy through sheer determination. You'd probably get along. Kara found herself smiling in return. Then let's find him. If his teacher can help me understand the Force, and if I can help keep your brother from falling to the dark side, that sounds like a fair trade. The decision made, they began preparations that night. Commander Trial provided them with a small courier ship, fast and forgettable, along with credentials that identified them as medical supply runners working for a neutral humanitarian organization. The cover story would hold up under casual Imperial inspection, but not deep investigation, which meant they needed to move quickly and avoid attention. They departed the next morning under a sky that was actually the curve of the barren moon's horizon, jumping to hyperspace within minutes and leaving behind the small outpost that had been Kara's introduction to galactic-scale warfare. The journey to Tatooine took 3 days through carefully plotted routes that avoided Imperial patrol lanes and major hyperspace intersections. During that time, Kara and Leia established the rapport that often develops between warriors who recognize each other's scars without needing to examine them. They spoke of Earth and Alderaan, comparing lost homes with the careful tenderness of those who understand that memory is both treasure and weapon. They spoke of family, of the expectations that come with bloodlines that carry weight and meaning, of the burden of living up to legacies written by people you never knew and can never surpass. Leia spoke of her father, Bail Organa, who had been a senator during the Clone Wars and one of the rebellion's founding architects before Alderaan's destruction claimed him. She spoke of her mother, a queen who had taught her that nobility meant service rather than privilege, and of the terrible irony that her adoption into House Organa had been designed to protect her from exactly the kind of destiny that had claimed her anyway. Kara spoke of Krypton, of her biological parents, Zor-El and Allura Inzi, scientists who had seen their world's end approaching and built escape pods for their children even as colleagues mocked their paranoia. She spoke of the Danvers family who had raised her on Earth, of learning to hide her differences while using them secretly to help, of the double life that had felt like both purpose and prison. "Do you ever wish you could just be normal?" Leia asked during their second day in hyperspace. "To have a life that doesn't revolve around duty and sacrifice?" Kara considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. But then I remember that normal means limited. It means watching people suffer because you're not strong enough or fast enough to help, and I can't live with that. Even if the responsibility is crushing, it's better than the guilt of doing nothing when you could have done everything." Leia nodded slowly, her expression distant. "My brother would say the same thing. That's what worries me. The dark side preys on people who care too much, who want to help too desperately. It whispers that greater power means greater good, that if you just push a little harder, break a few more rules, sacrifice a few more principles, then you can finally save everyone. And before you realize it, you've become what you were fighting against." The warning hung in the air between them, and Kara understood that it was not merely a description of general danger but a specific fear about people Leia loved, about Luke, about herself, perhaps even about Kara. They dropped from hyperspace at the edge of the Tatooine system, approaching the desert world with the caution of those who know the Empire maintains sensor stations throughout this sector, despite the planet's minimal strategic value. Tatooine was a backwater, a haven for smugglers and criminals, and those who wanted to disappear from galactic affairs, but Heart influence made it dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with Imperial jurisdiction. Leia guided their ship toward Mos Eisley spaceport with practiced skill, her piloting smooth despite the atmospheric turbulence that roiled the upper air. As they descended, Kara could see the endless dunes stretching in all directions, the twin suns blazing with light that her cells absorbed eagerly, and scattered settlements that looked like wounds on the landscape, as though civilization here was a condition the planet merely tolerated rather than welcomed. They set down in a bay rented under false credentials, powered down the engines, and prepared to venture into the spaceport's chaos. Mos Eisley was everything the rebel base had not been. Where the outpost had been quiet discipline and shared purpose, the spaceport was noise and conflict and barely restrained violence. Aliens of 100 species moved through narrow streets, conducting business in a dozen languages, carrying weapons openly in defiance of laws that had no enforcement here. The air smelled of ozone and spice, and something organic that Kara could not identify, and her enhanced senses were immediately overwhelmed by the sensory assault. Leia moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate worse places, and Kara followed, trying to moderate her reactions to stimuli that would have driven a normal human to sensory overload. They were heading toward a cantina on the spaceport's edge, a place where, according to Leia's contacts, they might find information about Luke Skywalker's current location. But before they could reach their destination, Kara's hearing caught a sound that stopped her cold. A child crying. Not in frustration or disappointment, but in terror and pain. She turned toward the source, her vision piercing through the cantina walls to the alley beyond, and saw a scene that ignited something in her chest that had nothing to do with the Force and everything to do with fundamental morality. A Trandoshan, reptilian and massive, was beating a young Rhodian child, while two other figures watched and laughed. The child was bleeding from wounds that looked serious, and the Trandoshan was winding up for another blow that would likely prove fatal. Kara moved. One moment she was beside Leia in the street. The next she was in the alley, her hand wrapped around the Trandoshan's wrist, stopping the descending blow with ease that made the creature's eyes widen in shock. She squeezed, not hard enough to break bone, but enough to convey that she could, and when she spoke, her voice carried the cold fury of someone who has seen too much suffering and decided that this, at least, she could prevent. Let the child go, now. The Trandoshan hissed, trying to pull free, and the two spectators reached for their weapons with the lazy confidence of those accustomed to intimidation working. Kara tightened her grip fractionally, and the Trandoshan screamed, the sound high and sharp, and dropped the child, who scrambled away with the desperate speed of prey escaping a predator. One of the spectators, a human with cybernetic enhancements covering half his face, drew a blaster and fired point blank at Kara's chest. The bolt struck her and dispersed, energy dissipating against invulnerable flesh, and the sudden silence in the alley was profound. Kara released the Trandoshan and turned to face the shooter with an expression that conveyed more with silence than words ever could. The man dropped his weapon and ran. His companion followed. And the Trandoshan, cradling his injured wrist, fled in the opposite direction with speed that belied his bulk. Kara knelt beside the injured Rhodian child, using her cape to gently clean the wounds while speaking in tones meant to comfort despite the language barrier. The child looked up at her with compound eyes that reflected her image in multifaceted patterns, and something passed between them that transcended words. Gratitude, recognition, the simple acknowledgement that someone had chosen to help when help was desperately needed. Leia appeared at the alley's entrance, her expression torn between approval and concern. That was conspicuous, very conspicuous. Half the spaceport will know within the hour that someone shrugged off a blaster bolt at point-blank range. Kara stood, making sure the child was stable before responding. I know, but I couldn't just watch. I'm not criticizing. I'm warning. Conspicuous means attention. Attention means questions. Questions mean someone will eventually inform the Empire that a human woman who appears immune to blaster fire is walking around Mos Eisley looking foreign and powerful. Before Kara could respond, a voice emerged from the cantina's shadows, aged and measured, and carrying weight that had nothing to do with volume. Perhaps then, it is fortunate that such questions often die in the desert, along with those who ask them unwisely. An old man stepped into view, robed in simple fabrics the color of sand, his face weathered by decades of exposure to Tatooine's brutal climate, but his eyes were clear and sharp, and they studied Kara with an intensity that suggested he was seeing past flesh and bone to something deeper. Leia's posture shifted, respect and relief mingling in her expression. "Ben, I hoped we'd find you here." The old man, Ben Kenobi as Kara would learn though his true name was Obi-Wan, inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Princess Leia, when I felt the disturbance in the Force 2 days ago, I suspected you might be involved. What I did not expect was that the disturbance would walk beside you wearing a cape of red and carrying the sun in her blood." His gaze fixed on Kara with the certainty of a master who has spent a lifetime studying the Force's currents and recognizes when something unprecedented has entered the pattern. "Kara Zor-El, welcome to Tatooine. We have much to discuss, and very little time to discuss it. The darkness stirs. It knows you are here." The safe house Ben led them to was carved into rock formations outside Mos Eisley, a hermitage that spoke of years lived in isolation and contemplation. Inside, the space was simple but maintained with care, walls lined with artifacts that Kara's educated eye recognized as having historical rather than monetary value. Jedi texts bound in materials that predated the Republic, holocrons whose facets caught the light in ways that suggested they contained more than mere data. Training implements worn smooth by decades of use. Ben prepared tea with the ritualized precision of someone for whom such actions were meditation rather than mere hospitality. As they sat, he studied Kara with that same penetrating intensity, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of pronouncement. "You are not of this galaxy. The Force recognizes this but does not reject you. Instead, it flows around you and through you in patterns I have never witnessed. You amplify its presence, make it more intense, more reactive, as though your very existence raises the stakes of every choice made in your vicinity." Kara set down her tea untasted. "The Knights of Ren said something similar, that I was breaking balance, that I was a prophecy." Ben's expression grew troubled. "The Knights draw their understanding from texts older and darker than the Jedi archives. Their prophecies are fragments of Sith teachings, corrupted over millennia, but not necessarily false. There are references in the oldest records, the ones maintained by the temple guards on worlds like Jeddah, to something called the Carrier, one who would arrive from beyond the known universe bearing power that predated the Force but resonated with it. One who would tip the scales toward light or dark through simple presence, forcing the galaxy to choose what it wished to become." Leia leaned forward. "You think Kara is this carrier?" "I think," Ben said carefully, "that prophecy is a dangerous lens through which to view the present. It encourages passive acceptance of perceived destiny rather than active choice. But I also think that Kara's arrival is not coincidental, not random. The Force works in patterns, and her presence here, now, at a moment when the galaxy teeters between imperial dominance and the fragile hope of rebellion, suggests purpose." Kara's frustration emerged in her voice. "I didn't come here on purpose. I crashed. I was trying to reach Earth after a disaster in space, and something went wrong with the dimensional barriers. This wasn't destiny. This was an accident." Ben's smile was gentle. "The Force has a way of making use of accidents. The question is not why you are here, but what you will do now that you have arrived. Will you attempt to force change through overwhelming power? Will you reshape this galaxy according to Earth's values and Earth's understanding of justice? Or will you learn to work within the existing patterns, to guide rather than dominate, to inspire rather than compel?" The question struck at something fundamental in Kara's understanding of heroism. On Earth, she had possessed power far beyond human baseline, but she had always operated within social and legal structures that constrained how she used that power. She helped people, stopped criminals, saved lives, but she did not dictate law or reshape governments or enforce her vision of justice on populations who had their own values. Here, in a galaxy where the Empire ruled through fear and the rebellion fought with limited resources, where the Force itself seemed to respond to intention and will, what were the limits? What was appropriate? If she could personally destroy Star Destroyers and confront Sith Lords and perhaps even challenge the Emperor himself, did she have an obligation to do so? Or would that kind of intervention create dependencies and resentments that would ultimately harm the people she was trying to help? I don't know, she admitted. On Earth, I tried to help without controlling, to save people without making them dependent. But I also had other heroes, other powerful beings who could check me if I went too far. Here, from what you've told me, I might be the most powerful individual in the galaxy. How do I help without becoming a tyrant? Ben's expression showed approval at the question itself. That awareness, that fear of your own potential for tyranny, is precisely what separates the Jedi from the Sith. Power without that awareness becomes corruption almost inevitably. The dark side thrives on certainty, on the conviction that you know what must be done and possess the strength to do it regardless of others' consent. The light side requires doubt, humility, the willingness to question your own judgment and defer to collective wisdom. Leia spoke quietly. But sometimes doubt paralyzes. Sometimes asking permission means watching people die while you wait for consensus. I've commanded forces in battle. I know what it means to make decisions that will cost lives, and I know that hesitation can be as deadly as recklessness. Yes, Ben acknowledged. Which is why balance is not compromise but wisdom. Knowing when to act decisively and when to step back. Trusting your moral center while remaining open to correction. It is the hardest path, which is why so few manage to walk it successfully. Their conversation was interrupted by a disturbance that all three of them felt, though only Ben and Leia had the training to understand what they were sensing. The Force rippled, a shockwave of dark side energy that emanated from somewhere in Mos Eisley, and through it came purpose and intent focused directly on their location. The Empire had found them. No, not the Empire. Something worse. Ben stood, his hand moving to his belt, where Kara now saw he carried a cylinder of metallic construction, elegant in its simplicity. A lightsaber. He did not ignite it, but his stance shifted into something combat-ready despite his age. They have sent the Inquisitors, Force sensitives who survived Order 66 by turning to the dark side and serving the Empire. They hunt Jedi and anyone who might threaten Palpatine's monopoly on Force power. They will have felt your presence, Kara, the way a shark smells blood in water. Kara moved to the entrance, her enhanced vision piercing the distance, and saw figures approaching through the desert. 4 of them, dressed in black armor adorned with Imperial insignias, moving with unnatural speed and carrying weapons that thrummed with the Force. Behind them, at a distance, ATST walkers were advancing, their mechanical stride eating distance, and beyond that, she could see the angular silhouette of an Imperial transport settling into position to cut off retreat. They brought an army, Leia observed, checking her blaster. No, Ben corrected. They brought witnesses. The Inquisitors want to capture Kara publicly to demonstrate Imperial power and discourage any thoughts of resistance. They intend to make an example. Kara's jaw tightened. Then they're going to be disappointed. She launched herself from the Hermitage entrance with speed that left sonic booms echoing off the rock formations, accelerating toward the Inquisitors with no subtlety and no hesitation. If they wanted a demonstration of power, she would provide one, but it would not be the demonstration they expected. The lead Inquisitor, distinguished by golden accents on his armor and a lightsaber whose blade burned with sickly yellow light, saw her coming and reacted with Force-enhanced reflexes. He thrust out both hands, and Kara felt the Force slam into her like a physical blow, an invisible pressure that tried to arrest her momentum and drive her into the sand. It was like flying into a strong headwind. Annoying, but not sufficient to stop her. She pushed through the Force barrier with raw physical power, and the shock on the Inquisitor's face was visible even through his helmet as her fist connected with his chest. She held back, not wanting to kill but needing to disable, and the Inquisitor flew backward 20 meters before hitting the sand in an impact that raised dust and ended with him lying still. The other three scattered, recognizing that frontal assault was inadequate, and began moving in pattern that spoke of extensive training in coordinated force combat. They were using the desert itself as a weapon, whipping sand into blinding storms, creating vortices of cutting particles, trying to overwhelm her senses and create openings for their lightsabers to find vulnerable points. Kara closed her eyes and relied on her other senses, hearing their heartbeats through the storm, feeling the displacement of air as they moved, tracking their positions through spatial awareness that had nothing to do with sight. When the first blade came for her neck, she caught it with her bare hand, her invulnerable skin resisting the lightsaber's plasma edge in a way that made the wielder gasp in shock. She ripped the weapon from his grip and crushed its hilt, destroying the kyber crystal within and ending its deadly hum. The remaining two Inquisitors retreated, their confidence shattered, and began calling for support through comm units. The ATST walkers accelerated, their pilots recognizing the threat level had escalated beyond original parameters, and Kara made a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous. She flew at the nearest walker, built up speed, and struck it with force calculated to disable rather than destroy. The walker's leg crumpled, the machine toppling with ponderous inevitability, and the pilot ejected before impact. The second walker opened fire, its blasters tracking her movement, and she dodged between bolts while closing distance. Behind her, she could hear the distinctive sound of a lightsaber igniting, and she glanced back to see Ben emerging from the hermitage, his blade burning blue-white, moving to intercept Inquisitors who were attempting to flank toward Leia's position. The old Jedi moved with speed and precision that belied his years, his fighting style economical and devastating, each motion serving multiple purposes and wasting no energy. Kara reached the second walker and tore its main cannon from the chassis, crushing the weapon's power systems and leaving the machine helpless. The pilot wisely chose to retreat, rather than engage with whatever had just dismantled his vehicle using bare hands. The battle ended as quickly as it began. The Inquisitors who could still move were retreating toward the Imperial transport, dragging their injured comrades, and the walker pilots were abandoning their machines in favor of survival. Within minutes, the desert was quiet again, except for the wind and the distant sound of repulsor lift engines ascending rapidly toward orbit. Ben deactivated his lightsaber and returned to where Leia stood with her blaster drawn but not fired. His expression was grave, that was restrained, admirably so, but also revealing. You demonstrated capabilities that will now be reported to every Imperial intelligence agency from here to Coruscant. By tomorrow, the Emperor himself will know that someone immune to lightsabers and capable of destroying walkers with bare hands is operating in rebel space. Kara felt the weight of the statement. She had been trying to help, trying to prevent the Inquisitors from capturing or killing them, but in doing so she had painted a target on herself that would draw increasingly dangerous attention. The calculus of power and consequence that she had managed relatively well on Earth was different here, more complex, with variables she did not yet understand. What should I have done? Let them take us? No, Ben said quietly. You should have done exactly what you did, but you must understand the implications. You have announced yourself to the galaxy's darkest powers. They will come for you, not with scouts and Inquisitors, but with everything they have, because you represent a threat to the order they have established. The Emperor tolerates no rivals, and you, whether you desire it or not, are a rival. Leia placed a hand on Kara's shoulder with unexpected gentleness. We need to leave Tatooine. Now, before reinforcements arrive. Ben, will you come with us? The old Jedi was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, and Kara realized he was communing with the Force, seeking guidance from patterns and currents she could feel but not interpret. When he spoke, his voice carried the sadness of difficult decisions. No, my place is here, watching, waiting. Luke will return when the Force wills it, and I must be here to continue his training. But you, Princess, should take Kara to the Alliance command. They need to know what they have found, and what it might cost them to shelter it. And Kara needs to understand what she is fighting for before she commits fully to this war. They departed within the hour, their ship climbing from Mos Eisley's spaceport, while Imperial sensors tracked their ascent and noted their vector. Ben's warning about attention proved accurate faster than any of them anticipated. Before they could enter hyperspace, 3 Imperial Star Destroyers dropped from lightspeed in a blockade formation, their turbolaser batteries already tracking the small courier vessel. Leia swore in 3 languages and began emergency evasive maneuvers, but against Star Destroyer firing solutions, evasion was merely a method of choosing which shot would kill you, rather than preventing death entirely. The first volley missed by meters, the second closer, and the third would have vaporized them if Kara had not done something that defied every principle of spaceflight she had learned on Earth. She unsealed the ship's emergency hatch and flew out into the void once more, positioning herself between the courier vessel and the incoming fire. The turbolaser bolts struck her with force that should have atomized any physical object, and she absorbed the impacts with pain that burned through her cells like acid, but she held position and the ship behind her remained intact. The Star Destroyers adjusted their firing solutions, recognizing the shield she had become, and increased their barrage intensity. Kara gritted her teeth against pain that was more intense than anything she had experienced in this galaxy, understanding that turbolaser fire was qualitatively different from blaster bolts, operating at energy levels that even her enhanced physiology struggled to dissipate. But she held, and in holding, in choosing to endure rather than retaliate, in using her power to protect rather than destroy, she felt something shift in the force around her. The chaotic amplification that had characterized her presence began to stabilize, finding patterns, and for the first time since her arrival in this galaxy, she felt the force not as an external current, but as something that responded to intention and choice. She raised one hand toward the Star Destroyers, not to attack but to push, and the force moved through her in a way it had not before. An invisible pressure extended from her palm, and she felt the Star Destroyer's forward momentum stall, felt its massive bulk resisting her will, and pushed harder. The ship did not move far, perhaps 100 meters, but it moved, and that was impossible, and the confusion among the Imperial command crew was visible in the way their firing patterns broke as officers tried to understand how a single person could affect capital ship positioning. Kara used that confusion to accelerate back to the courier vessel, sealed the hatch, and shouted at Leia to jump immediately. They entered hyperspace, trailing atmosphere and emergency klaxons, but alive. In the ship's cramped cockpit, Leia stared at Kara with an expression that mixed awe with something that looked like fear. You moved a Star Destroyer, with the Force, without training, without understanding how. That's not supposed to be possible. Kara collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, her body aching from the absorbed energy, her mind reeling from the sensation of having used the Force deliberately for the first time. I don't know what I did. I just knew I had to protect the ship, and the energy was there, and I pushed. The energy is not supposed to be there like that. The Force requires focus, meditation, years of training to direct with precision. You used it like a blunt instrument and still achieved effects that would challenge a Jedi Master. The fear in Leia's voice was not fear of Kara but fear for her, and Kara understood the distinction. What she had done was dangerous not because it threatened others, but because it revealed how little she understood about the power she was wielding. She was a child with a thermal detonator, capable of causing devastation without intending it, and the galaxy had no shortage of people who would be happy to point her at targets and watch her detonate. They traveled for 2 days through hyperspace, making random jumps to throw off any pursuit, before finally arriving at the coordinates Leia provided. The Rebel fleet was not a fleet in any traditional sense, but rather a scattered collection of ships that maintained loose coordination through encrypted communications and shared purpose. Mon Calamari cruisers salvaged from shipyards, Corellian corvettes acquired through sympathetic captains, transport vessels converted into mobile command centers. They docked with Home One, the largest of the Mon Calamari cruisers and current location of the Alliance High Command, and Kara found herself walking through corridors filled with hope and desperation in equal measure. The rebels here were professionals, military personnel, and political operatives who had given up normal lives to fight a war they could not win through conventional means, and they watched her passage with the same expression she had seen at the outpost. Curiosity, suspicion, that dangerous worship of power that made her profoundly uncomfortable. Admiral Akbar, the fleet commander whose species physiology gave him an appearance that Earth would have classified as amphibious, regarded Kara with large eyes that missed nothing. Beside him stood Mon Mothma, the Alliance's political leader, a woman whose presence radiated authority despite her lack of military rank. Leia made introductions with formal efficiency, summarizing Kara's arrival and the events on Tatooine in concise military language that stripped away emotion and focused on capability assessment. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Mon Mothma spoke first. "You are saying this woman can withstand capital ship weapons, move through vacuum unaided, fly at speeds comparable to starfighters, and manipulate the Force without training?" "Yes." "And she wants to help the rebellion?" "Yes. But she is not from this galaxy, does not understand our politics, our history, or our cultural context." Leia hesitated. "Also yes." Akbar's voice carried the measured assessment of a career military strategist. "Then we must determine whether she is an asset or a liability. Power without understanding is often more dangerous than enemy action." Kara, who had been standing silently during this evaluation, spoke for the first time since entering the room. "I understand that I'm a complication. I understand that my presence draws Imperial attention and that my abilities are difficult to classify or control. But I also understand that there are people suffering under this empire, and I have the power to help them. I'm not asking you to direct me or deploy me like a weapon. I'm asking you to tell me where the suffering is worst, where intervention might save lives, and I'll do what I can." Mon Mothma studied her with eyes that had seen too many well-intentioned people become corrupted by power or broken by consequence. "The suffering is everywhere. The Empire has subjugated thousands of worlds, enslaved billions, destroyed cultures, and crushed dissent with systematic brutality. If you try to save everyone, you will save no one. You will exhaust yourself or become the very thing you oppose, a force that imposes its will regardless of consent." The words echoed Ben's warning, and Kara felt the weight of limitation in a way she had not experienced on Earth. There, the problems had been local, manageable, scaled to a single planet with a population measured in billions rather than quadrillions. Here, the suffering was so vast, so systemic, that individual intervention was meaningless unless it addressed root causes rather than symptoms. "Then help me understand the root causes. Help me see where strategic intervention might create cascading improvements. I'm not naive enough to think I can save everyone, but I'm also not cynical enough to think that means I shouldn't try to save anyone." Akbar and Mon Mothma exchanged glances, a silent communication between leaders who had worked together long enough to speak volumes without words. Finally, Mon Mothma nodded slowly. "Very well. We will provide you with intelligence briefings and operational context. But understand this, Kara Zor-El, the moment your actions endanger this fleet or compromise operations that have taken months to arrange, we will ask you to leave. We cannot afford to shelter someone who draws star destroyers like a magnet simply by existing. Is that clear?" "Crystal." The following week was educational in ways that made Kara question everything she thought she understood about heroism. She attended briefings that detailed Imperial atrocities with bureaucratic precision, worlds strip-mined for resources, populations relocated to serve industrial needs, dissidents executed publicly to discourage resistance. She learned about the Empire's military structure, the vast hierarchy of officers and administrators who maintained order through fear and the promise of advancement. She learned about the rebellion's limitations, the constant struggle to acquire weapons and supplies, the difficulty of recruiting when failure meant not merely death, but the destruction of entire families and communities. She learned about operations that had succeeded at great cost, and operations that had failed despite perfect planning. and she began to understand that war at this scale was not a series of heroic interventions, but rather a grinding attrition of resources and morale. And she learned about Luke Skywalker, the young Jedi who had destroyed the Death Star and become a symbol of hope for the rebellion, was currently operating with a small team on a mission to intercept an Imperial convoy carrying kyber crystals. The crystals were being transported to a research facility where they would be used in weapons development, and preventing their delivery could slow the Empire's superweapon programs by months. But the convoy was heavily guarded, protected by 3 Imperial-class Star Destroyers and a complement of TIE fighters that would overwhelm conventional rebel attack forces. The operation had been deemed high risk with uncertain reward, approved only because the target's strategic value justified potential losses. Kara studied the mission briefing and understood immediately what the Alliance leadership was hoping without saying it aloud. They wanted her to intervene. They wanted her to use her abilities to tilt a battle that could not otherwise be won. They wanted to see what she could do in a controlled context before committing to full partnership. She accepted the mission because it aligned with her values, because preventing weapons development was clearly defensive rather than aggressive, and because she wanted to meet Luke Skywalker and understand what a Jedi in training looked like in practice rather than theory. Leia accompanied her, ostensibly as liaison but really as moral anchor, and they took a fast attack shuttle to the interception coordinates where Luke's team was already engaged. The battle was chaos when they arrived. TIE fighters swarmed like angry insects around a handful of rebel X-wings, their numerical advantage overwhelming despite the superior skill of the rebel pilots. The Star Destroyers maintained formation, their point defense systems creating kill zones that made approach vectors nearly impossible, and the convoy itself was accelerating toward the hyperspace jump point that would carry it beyond reach. Kara saw all of this in the seconds after they dropped from light speed, her enhanced perception processing information faster than the ship's tactical computer could display it, and she made a decision that was part calculation and part instinct. She unsealed the shuttle's hatch for the 3rd time in as many days, and flew out into combat with no armor, no weapons, and no plan beyond stopping the convoy from escaping. She accelerated toward the lead Star Destroyer, dodging turbolaser fire that tracked her movement with increasing desperation, and struck the ship's bridge with precision that shattered transparasteel but avoided killing the crew. The bridge lost pressure, and the Star Destroyer's command structure dissolved into chaos as officers scrambled for emergency stations. She moved to the 2nd Star Destroyer and repeated the action, and then the 3rd, systematically eliminating the convoy's coordination in 90 seconds of precise violence that left the ships drifting but intact, their crews alive but unable to effectively command their vessels or coordinate defense. The TIE fighters broke off their attacks on the X-wings and converged on her with the desperate intensity of pilots who recognize when a battle has shifted beyond their parameters. She did not destroy them, but rather disabled them, ripping wings from chassis or crushing cockpit viewports just enough to force emergency ejections, giving pilots the chance to survive while eliminating their combat effectiveness. In 5 minutes, the battle was over. In 5 minutes, she had accomplished what a conventional rebel force could not have achieved in hours with significant casualties. And in those 5 minutes, she had demonstrated to everyone watching that she was capable of single-handedly altering the outcome of fleet engagements, which meant she was capable of winning this war if she chose to involve herself fully. The rebel ships moved in to capture the convoy, and Kara returned to the shuttle where Leia was waiting with an expression that was equal parts relief and concern. Efficient, devastating, merciful, and absolutely terrifying from a strategic perspective, Kara understood. Because if I can do this, why does the rebellion need anyone else? Exactly. And once that question starts circulating, once people begin believing that victory depends on you rather than collective action, the rebellion stops being a movement and becomes a cult of personality. That's not liberation. That's just replacing one form of tyranny with another. The critique stung because it was accurate. Kara had acted with good intentions, had minimized casualties, and achieved objectives, but she had also demonstrated power so overwhelming that it overshadowed everyone else's contributions. The rebel pilots who had been risking their lives were reduced to supporting characters in a story where she was the protagonist, and that dynamic would poison morale if it continued. She was saved from having to respond by the arrival of Luke Skywalker's X-Wing, which docked with the shuttle using magnetic clamps and allowed the young Jedi to board through the airlock. He entered with enthusiasm that reminded Kara of herself at that age, before experience had taught her the weight of power and the cost of intervention. That was incredible. I've never seen anyone move like that in space. Are you really from another galaxy? Leia said you're stronger than anyone, Force sensitive, and that you make the Force itself more intense just by being near it. Is that true? Can you teach me? The questions tumbled out with genuine excitement, and Kara found herself smiling despite the complicated emotions churning in her chest. Luke Skywalker was young, maybe 19 or 20, with blonde hair and blue eyes that held optimism that the galaxy had not yet crushed. He wore the orange flight suit of a rebel pilot, and his lightsaber hung at his belt with the casual confidence of someone who had used it in battle and survived. Leia hugged her brother with affection that transcended their complicated family history, and then made introductions. Luke, this is Kara Zor-El. Kara, my brother Luke. Try not to encourage his worst impulses. He has enough of those, without help. Luke's grin was infectious. She means my tendency to trust the Force and do things that look reckless but work out in the end. Luck, Leia corrected. What you call trusting the Force, I call luck. And luck runs out. Their banter was familiar, the kind of sibling dynamic that transcended cultures and galaxies, and Kara felt a pang of homesickness for Earth and the relationships she had left behind. But she pushed the feeling aside and focused on the young Jedi, who was regarding her with fascination and something deeper, a recognition through the Force that went beyond mere curiosity. You feel different, Luke said quietly. Like you're not supposed to be here, but also like you're exactly where you need to be. How is that possible? Kara considered how to answer honestly without overwhelming him with complications. I don't know. I'm still figuring out the rules here. On my world, I was powerful because of biology and physics. Here, there's this Force energy that seems to respond to my presence and amplify, but I don't know how to control it, or even if I should try to control it. Luke's expression became serious, the enthusiasm giving way to something more mature. Ben told me about you. He said you're a test, not for the Empire or the Rebellion, but for the Force itself, to see if light or dark will claim you, and what that claiming will mean for the galaxy. That's a lot of pressure to put on someone who just wants to help. Welcome to being a Jedi. Luke's smile returned, smaller but genuine. We spend our whole lives trying to help, while everyone else projects their fears and hopes onto us. It's exhausting and necessary, and the only way forward that doesn't lead to darkness. They spoke for hours as the captured convoy was secured, and the rebel fleet prepared to jump to a rendezvous point. Luke shared stories of his training with Ben, of learning to trust the Force even when it led him toward danger, of the constant tension between action and patience that defined Jedi philosophy. Kara shared her own experiences on Earth, of learning to hide her differences while using them to help, of the loneliness that came with power that set you apart from everyone you cared about. And slowly, through conversation and shared understanding, she began to comprehend what it meant to be a Force-sensitive being in this galaxy. The responsibility that came not merely from possessing power, but from recognizing that power's effect on the larger pattern, the way individual choices rippled outward through connections that were invisible but real. The Force connects all living things, Luke explained, repeating lessons Ben had taught him. When you act, especially when you act with great power, you don't just affect the immediate situation, you affect the web of relationships and choices that surround it. If you save someone using overwhelming force, you might stop their suffering in that moment, but you also teach them that problems are solved through power rather than community. And that teaching spreads, influencing how they approach future challenges, shaping what they believe about justice and strength. Kara absorbed this, mapping it against her experiences on Earth. So even when you have the power to solve a problem, you have to consider whether solving it that way will create larger problems down the line. Exactly. It's not about being weak or refusing to help. It's about understanding that how you help matters as much as the help itself. The Jedi failed because they became so focused on maintaining order that they forgot to nurture the conditions that make order possible. They imposed peace rather than cultivating it, and when the Clone Wars came, they were unable to adapt. The conversation was interrupted by an alert from the shuttle's communication system. Admiral Akbar was requesting their immediate return to Home 1 for an emergency briefing. Something had happened, something significant enough to recall all senior personnel and their guests. When they arrived at the command center, the atmosphere was tense with barely controlled urgency. Mon Mothma stood at the central holodisplay, her expression grave, and around her the Alliance's senior leadership wore expressions that ranged from shock to fury. 3 hours ago, Mon Mothma began without preamble. Imperial forces launched a coordinated assault on 17 rebel safe houses across the Outer Rim. Casualties are still being assessed, but preliminary reports suggest hundreds dead and thousands displaced. The attacks were too coordinated, too precise to be coincidental. Someone gave the Empire our locations. The room erupted in accusations and counter-accusations, officers pointing fingers at intelligence divisions and security protocols, but Mon Mothma raised a hand for silence. The attacks all occurred after Kara Zor-El's engagement with the Imperial convoy. The timing suggests the Empire has prioritized finding her and is willing to destroy our infrastructure to flush her out. They are treating her as a strategic asset of sufficient value to justify scorched earth tactics. All eyes turned to Kara, and she felt the weight of their judgment, their fear, their desperate calculation of whether her presence was worth the cost it was extracting from people who could not defend themselves against star destroyers and orbital bombardment. Leia spoke into the silence, her voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. This is not Kara's fault. The Empire would have found those safe houses eventually. She simply accelerated a timeline that was already in motion. Perhaps, Akbar said carefully, but the question remains whether we can afford to shelter someone the Empire wants so desperately that they will burn the galaxy to find her. Kara made a decision that hurt but felt necessary. I'll leave. I'll take a ship and go somewhere remote, draw Imperial attention away from the rebellion. You give me coordinates to a forgotten system, and I disappear until I figure out how to get home or how to fight this war without endangering everyone around me. No. Luke's voice was firm despite his youth, and he moved to stand beside Kara with body language that declared allegiance. Running means the Empire wins. It means they can use fear to drive away anyone powerful enough to challenge them. If Kara leaves now, she confirms their strategy and ensures they'll use it again against anyone else who might threaten their control. Mon Mothma's expression was unreadable. Then what do you propose, young Skywalker? That we harbor her while the Empire systematically destroys our support network? That we sacrifice hundreds or thousands of lives for one person, no matter how powerful? Luke's jaw tightened. I propose we use their obsession against them. If the Empire wants Kara badly enough to launch major operations, that means she represents a threat significant enough to divert resources from other objectives. We use her presence to draw Imperial forces into engagements where we can hurt them, where we can demonstrate that pursuing her costs more than ignoring her. The strategy was risky, potentially brilliant, and depended on treating Kara as bait rather than savior. She should have resented the calculation, but instead she found it refreshing. Luke was not treating her as a goddess or weapon, but as a tactical asset with agency and choice, and that respect mattered more than any grand pronouncements about her importance. I'm willing, Kara said quietly. If it means protecting people and hurting the Empire, I'm willing to be the target they chase. Mon Mothma studied them both. These two young people offering themselves up for purposes that would likely end in pain or death, and her expression softened fractionally. Very well. We will designate you as a special operations team. Luke Skywalker will be your liaison and guide, teaching you about the Force and this galaxy's cultures, while you conduct operations designed to draw Imperial attention and create opportunities for strategic strikes. Princess Leia will coordinate with Fleet Command to ensure support is available when needed. And Kara Zor-El, you will do your best to learn restraint To understand that power used wisely is worth more than power used absolutely. It was not the mission Kara had expected when she crashed into this galaxy, but it was one she could embrace. Working with Luke, learning about the Force, helping people while drawing the Empire's fire away from civilian targets, these were objectives she understood and could pursue with clear conscience. The following months established patterns that would define the galactic conflict's next phase. Kara and Luke traveled together, visiting worlds where Imperial oppression was harshest, conducting operations that freed prisoners, destroyed weapons facilities, and disrupted supply lines. They were not subtle and did not try to be. Every operation was designed to announce their presence, to dare the Empire to respond, and then to defeat that response in ways that humiliated Imperial commanders and inspired hope in populations that had forgotten hope's taste. Luke taught Kara about the Force through practice rather than theory. He showed her how to meditate, to feel the currents of energy that flowed through all living things, to sense intention and emotion in others. He demonstrated basic techniques, telekinesis, and Force-enhanced reflexes, and watched with fascination as Kara replicated them through sheer power rather than refined control. "You're like a Force hurricane," he observed after she had accidentally destroyed a training remote by pushing too hard with telekinesis. "Everything you do is overwhelming, excessive. You need to learn finesse." Kara, frustrated by her inability to moderate her Force abilities, despite having perfect control over her physical powers, responded with more honesty than diplomacy. "I don't think the Force works the same way in me as it does in you. You're connected to it naturally, born to it. I'm an alien whose biology somehow amplifies it. It's like trying to play a musical instrument when you can only hear every sound at maximum volume." Luke considered this, and gradually their training shifted. Instead of trying to make Kara more like a Jedi, he began helping her find ways to express her power that aligned with her nature, rather than fighting it. She would never have a Jedi's subtle control, but she could learn when to apply Force and when to restrain it, when to act decisively and when to step back. Their partnership deepened through shared danger and shared purpose. They saved a colony on Ryloth from Imperial enslavement, fought together against an Inquisitor who had been hunting Force-sensitive children, and prevented the destruction of a moon whose population had dared to resist Imperial taxation. Each victory cost them something: physical injury or emotional exhaustion, or the knowledge that they could not save everyone, but each victory also reinforced their belief that resistance mattered, that fighting back was better than accepting tyranny. Leia coordinated their operations from Home 1, providing intelligence and ensuring their actions aligned with broader rebel strategy. She watched her brother grow from an enthusiastic youth into a warrior who understood war's cost, and she watched Kara struggle with the realization that even overwhelming power could not solve problems rooted in ideology and culture. But she also watched the Empire's response, and what she saw troubled her. The Emperor had dispatched his most deadly servant to deal with the problem. Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith, was hunting them with resources and authority that dwarfed anything the Inquisitors had possessed. Star Destroyer battle groups moved according to patterns designed to corner rather than confront, and Imperial intelligence was mapping Kara and Luke's movements with precision that suggested information sources within the rebellion itself. The confrontation, when it came, occurred on a world called Bracos, an industrial moon where the Empire maintained weapons factories worked by slave labor. Kara and Luke had intended a simple raid, free the slaves and destroy the factories, but they walked into a trap that had been months in the making. Darth Vader was waiting for them. The Dark Lord stood in the factory's main production floor, a figure of black armor and mechanical breathing that spoke of artificial life, sustained by hatred and will. His presence in the Force was overwhelming, a void that seemed to consume light rather than emanate darkness, and around him the air itself felt heavy with accumulated suffering. Luke's hand went to his lightsaber, but Vader made no move to attack. He simply stood, studying them with attention that pressed against Kara's mind like physical weight. When he spoke, his voice was mechanically modulated but carried authority that seemed to resonate in bone and blood. "Kara Zor-El, the Emperor is most interested in you," He offers you a choice: join the Empire willingly, and your power will be directed toward galactic order rather than wasted on futile rebellion. Refuse, and you will be taken by force, and everyone you have touched will be erased as examples of what happens to those who resist Imperial will. Kara's fists clenched. She could feel Luke's tension beside her, could sense the factory workers who had been frozen by Vader's appearance, could hear the TIE fighter squadrons circling overhead waiting for the command to attack. This was the moment she had been dreading since arriving in this galaxy, the moment when she would have to decide whether to fight someone who might actually be able to hurt her. I've heard offers like that before. They always come from people who mistake fear for respect. I'm not interested. Vader's head tilted fractionally. Then you will learn what fear truly means. He moved with speed that surprised her despite Luke's warnings, his lightsaber igniting in a slash that would have bisected her if she had not been Kryptonian. The crimson blade struck her shoulder, and she felt pain, real and intense, as the plasma edge found a vulnerability that turbolasers had not, as though the lightsaber operated on principles that bypassed some aspect of her invulnerability. She stumbled back, and Vader pressed the attack. His fighting style economical and brutal, each strike aimed at vital points and backed by force-enhanced strength. Luke engaged with his own blade, blue meeting red in a shower of sparks, but Vader fought both of them simultaneously with the ease of a master who had forgotten what it meant to struggle. Kara tried to use her speed, to flank and strike from unexpected angles, but Vader anticipated her movements through the Force, positioning himself to block or counter before she could fully commit to attacks. She tried to use her strength, to physically overpower him, but he redirected her momentum with Force techniques that turned her power against her. And all the while he spoke, his voice carrying through the mechanized breathing with terrible patience. You are strong, but strength without purpose is meaningless. You fight for a rebellion that cannot win, for people who will betray you the moment your usefulness ends. The Emperor offers you purpose, direction, the chance to reshape this galaxy according to principles of order rather than chaos. Your order is built on suffering. Kara gasped, blocking a strike that sent tremors through her arm. On slavery and fear and the destruction of anyone who disagrees with you. That's not order. That's tyranny with better marketing. And the rebellion offers what? Hope? Vader's laugh was terrible, a sound like metal tearing. Hope is the cruelest lie of all. It promises change while delivering only prolonged suffering. Better to accept reality and build something stable than to chase illusions of freedom that will only lead to greater pain. Luke, struggling to hold his ground against Vader's assault, shouted above the sound of clashing blades. You're wrong. Hope is what keeps people fighting. It's what kept my father fighting before you killed him. Vader went still, and the sudden cessation of movement was more frightening than his attacks had been. The Force around him churned with something dark and complex, and when he spoke again, his voice carried emotion that the mechanical modulation could not entirely conceal. Your father is dead. I ensured it. You're lying. Ben told me about him, about Anakin Skywalker, the Jedi Knight who was your rival before the Empire. The name hung in the air, and Kara felt the Force convulse around them, felt something massive and painful tear through the pattern. Vader's breathing intensified, the mechanical rhythm becoming irregular, and his lightsaber lowered fractionally. Anakin Skywalker is dead. I killed him. Everything he was, everything he loved, I destroyed because he was weak and sentimental and doomed to fail. Luke's face transformed, understanding and horror mingling in an expression that aged him years in seconds. You're my father. Anakin Skywalker is Darth Vader. The revelation shattered the combat's momentum. Vader did not deny it. Luke did not attack. And Kara, standing between them, understood that she was witnessing something more profound than a battle. She was witnessing the moment when a young Jedi learned that the monster he fought was the hero he had been taught to revere, and that realization broke something fundamental in his worldview. Vader recovered first, his discipline reasserting control over emotion. Yes, I am your father, and you will join me, Luke Skywalker, or you will die. Those are your only options. The Emperor has foreseen it. But before Luke could respond, before Kara could position herself to protect him from whatever came next, the factory exploded. Not from their battle, but from rebel charges placed by teams who had infiltrated during the confrontation, demolition experts who had seen the opportunity to destroy Imperial infrastructure while Vader's attention was focused on the intruders. The ceiling collapsed in sections, machinery toppled, and slave workers ran for exits that Leia's teams had cleared while Luke and Kara had drawn Vader's focus. In the chaos, Vader made a choice. He could pursue them, could continue the battle, or he could save the factory and its strategic value. He chose strategy over vengeance, using the Force to contain the worst of the destruction, and by the time he had stabilized the situation, Kara and Luke were gone, evacuated by rebel transport, along with 300 freed slaves who would remember this day as the moment when hope became real again. On the transport, Luke was silent, processing revelations that rewrote his understanding of identity and destiny. Kara sat beside him, offering presence without words, understanding that some knowledge needed time to integrate. Finally, he spoke, his voice small and broken. "How do I fight him now? How do I fight my father?" Kara did not have an answer from experience, but she had one from principle. You fight what he's become, not what he was. The man who was your father is gone, killed by the ideology he chose and the darkness he embraced. What's left is the armor and the hatred. You honor your father's memory by refusing to become what he became, not by trying to redeem something that doesn't want redemption. Luke's expression showed pain but also acceptance. Ben told me the Force would test me. I thought he meant physical danger or temptation to power. I didn't think he meant having to accept that my father is the Empire's greatest weapon. Maybe that's the hardest test. Choosing to fight even when fighting means hurting people you love. Choosing light even when darkness wears a familiar face. They returned to Home One carrying freed slaves and new understanding about the enemy they faced. Mon Mothma received the news of Vader's involvement with grim acknowledgement, immediately adjusting rebel strategy to account for the Empire's escalation. If Vader was hunting them personally, if the Emperor considered Kara important enough to deploy his enforcer, then the stakes had risen beyond mere tactical concerns into the realm of galactic power dynamics. "We need to disappear for a time," Mon Mothma told them during the debriefing. "Let the Empire waste resources searching while we rebuild networks and establish new safe houses. Luke, take Kara to Dagobah. Master Yoda will be able to help her in ways we cannot, and you both need training that only a true Jedi Master can provide." Kara had heard Luke speak of Yoda, the ancient Jedi who had survived Order 66 through exile and who represented the last living connection to the Jedi Order's deepest wisdom. The prospect of meeting him was both appealing and terrifying, because she suspected that Yoda would see through her pretenses and understand exactly what she was and what she represented to the Force. They traveled to Dagobah in a small scout ship, just the two of them, dropping into the planet's dense atmosphere with care. The world was alive in ways that went beyond mere biology. The Force here was thick, almost tangible, flowing through the swamps and forests like blood through veins, and Kara felt it pressing against her consciousness with insistent curiosity. Yoda's dwelling was small, deliberately humble, a structure that spoke of choices to renounce grandeur in favor of genuine simplicity. The ancient Jedi Master emerged as they approached, leaning on his Gaimer stick but radiating presence that made his diminutive stature irrelevant. His eyes, enormous and knowing, studied Kara with attention that felt like being read at the cellular level. "So, the carrier has arrived. Felt you in the Force, I did. From across the galaxy. Loud, you are. Unsubtle, like a youngling shouting in a library." Kara, uncertain how to respond to being compared to a shouting child, settled for honesty. "I don't know how to be subtle here. Everything in me amplifies the Force without me trying." Yoda's ears twitched in what might have been amusement. "Trying, you are not. That is the problem. Control comes from effort, not from nature. Born strong, you were, but strength without discipline is chaos wearing a heroic mask." He gestured toward his dwelling with his stick. "Come. Teach you. I will, if learn you can." but warn you, I must. What I teach may make you weaker before it makes you stronger. Accept this, you must, or leave now and risk becoming what the dark side desires." Kara glanced at Luke, who nodded encouragingly, and together they entered Yoda's home to begin training that would reshape her understanding of power and purpose. The months that followed were among the hardest of Kara's life, not because they involved physical danger, but because they required her to confront aspects of herself she had been avoiding since arriving in this galaxy. Yoda's teaching methods were frustrating, indirect, designed to force students to discover truths rather than simply receive instruction. He would set seemingly impossible tasks and then refuse to explain how to accomplish them. He would ask questions that had no clear answers and demand responses anyway. He would demonstrate Force techniques and then insist that Kara replicate them using entirely different methods because her connection to the Force operated on principles that formal Jedi training had not accounted for. "Different, you are," Yoda said during one particularly frustrating session where Kara had been trying and failing to levitate a rock with the delicacy Yoda had demonstrated. "Not born to the Force, but born beside it. Your power comes from within, not from connection. So channel it, you must, rather than suppress it. I don't understand the difference. Suppress means make small. Channel means give direction. A river suppressed becomes stagnant. A river channeled becomes useful. You try to make your power small enough to control. Instead, make your control large enough to direct your power." The distinction was subtle but profound. Instead of trying to dial down her amplification of the Force, Kara needed to learn to shape its expression, to decide what effects she wanted, and then allow her power to flow toward those intentions, rather than trying to moderate the power itself. It was like learning to fly all over again, that same process of understanding what your body could do and then choosing how to express those capabilities. And slowly, painfully, she began to make progress. Luke trained beside her, deepening his own connection to the Force, learning advanced techniques that would serve him in confrontations to come. And gradually, watching his progress, Kara began to understand something fundamental about the difference between their relationships to power. Luke was learning to become one with the Force, to let it guide his actions and trust its wisdom. Kara was learning to become a force unto herself, to direct reality through will and power while remaining conscious of consequences. Both were valid paths, but they led toward different destinations and carried different costs. "Jedi, you will never be," Yoda told her one evening as they sat outside his dwelling watching the swamp's bioluminescence paint patterns in the darkness. "Too much power you have, too much self. The Jedi way requires surrender, becoming an instrument of the Force's will. But instrument you cannot be. You are the will itself, given form and choice. Dangerous, this is, but also necessary." "Why necessary?" "Because the Force seeks balance. But balance does not mean equal light and dark, means equal capacity for choice. The Sith believe strength creates right. The Jedi believed surrender creates wisdom. Both wrong, they were. Choice creates meaning. Your presence, your power that does not fit existing patterns, forces the galaxy to choose consciously rather than drift according to ancient ideologies. Catalyst, you are. For good or ill, that depends on choices made by all, not just you." The teaching continued for months, punctuated by brief missions when the rebellion required their assistance. They would leave Dagobah, conduct operations with increased precision and reduced collateral damage, and return for more training. And each time they returned, Yoda seemed frailer, more transparent, as though the act of teaching them was consuming his remaining vitality. Finally, on a night when the swamp was unnaturally quiet, Yoda called them both to his side. "Time, I have run out of, but taught you what you needed to learn. I have. Luke, a Jedi you are becoming. But remember, a Jedi's strength lies in compassion, not in power. Your father forgot this. Do not repeat his mistake." Luke's eyes glistened. "Master, you can't." "Can and will," Yoda interrupted gently. 900 years old, I am. Earned rest, I have. But you, pass on what you have learned. The Force will be with you, always. He turned his enormous eyes to Kara. And you, Carrier, choose wisely when the moment comes. The galaxy will offer you dominion, will beg you to save it through strength. Refuse, you must, even when refusal seems cruel. True power lies not in saving others, but in teaching them to save themselves. His breathing slowed, and the force around them swelled with something vast and peaceful. Yoda closed his eyes, and his body began to fade, becoming one with the Force in the manner of Jedi who had mastered death's final lesson. When he was gone, Luke and Kara sat in silence, mourning a teacher who had given them more than technique, who had given them perspective and wisdom, and the understanding that power without purpose was merely destruction, waiting for a target. They returned to the rebellion, changed, matured, ready for what came next. What came next was the Empire's endgame. Intelligence reached the rebel fleet that the Emperor himself was preparing something massive, a gathering of resources and personnel that suggested a major operation in the planning stages. The location was unknown, the objective unclear, but the scale implied intentions beyond mere suppression of rebels. Mon Mothma called an emergency council, and the Alliance's senior leadership debated response options with the intensity of people who understood this might be their last chance to affect the war's trajectory. "We need more information," Admiral Akbar insisted. "Without knowing the Emperor's objective, we cannot formulate effective countermeasures." "We don't have time for information gathering," another admiral countered. "If the Empire is concentrating forces, we should strike now, while they're vulnerable to disruption." The debate continued until Leia spoke, her voice cutting through the argument with royal authority and military pragmatism perfectly balanced. "There's another option. We send someone the Emperor wants directly to him. We offer Kara as bait in exchange for information about his plans." The room erupted in protest, but Leia continued over the objections. "She's powerful enough to survive initial contact, and she can gather intelligence we cannot acquire through conventional means. If we dress it up as her, considering the Emperor's offer as her wanting to understand what the Empire represents before making a final decision, we might get access to command-level discussions." Kara, who had been listening from the periphery, spoke into the chaos. "I'm willing, if it means learning what the Emperor plans and potentially preventing something catastrophic. I'm willing to walk into his presence." Luke moved to stand beside her, his expression determined. "Then I'm going too. We've fought together this far. I'm not stopping now." Mon Mothma studied them both. These two young people volunteering for something that was either brilliant strategy or sophisticated suicide, and finally nodded with the exhausted resolve of a leader who has run out of good options. "Very well. We will arrange a meeting under diplomatic protocols. Kara Zor-El wishes to discuss terms of alliance with the Empire. The Emperor will certainly grant audience to someone he's been hunting for months. And when you're there, you learn everything you can about his plans. But if it goes wrong, if you're captured or turned, we will disavow knowledge of your mission. Is that acceptable?" "Yes." The arrangements took a week, negotiations conducted through intermediaries and encrypted channels, but finally the confirmation came. The Emperor would receive them on Coruscant in the Imperial Palace under temporary truce protocols that were worth approximately nothing but provided diplomatic cover for what everyone understood was a gambit on both sides. They traveled to Coruscant in a diplomatic shuttle, unarmed per protocols, carrying nothing but their personal effects and the knowledge that they were walking into the heart of Imperial power with no backup and no extraction plan. The capital world was overwhelming in its scale, a city that covered an entire planet's surface, layer upon layer of construction, reaching into the atmosphere and descending into abyssal depths where light had not touched in millennia. The palace dominated the skyline, a structure of impossible proportions that spoke of power consolidated and projected without apology or restraint. They were escorted through corridors of polished stone and guarded checkpoints, past stormtroopers and Imperial guards whose red armor marked them as the Emperor's personal protection. The palace radiated dark side energy so thick that Kara could feel it pressing against her consciousness, see it flowing through the architecture like poison through veins. Finally, they were brought to the throne room, a vast space that dwarfed human scale deliberately, designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. And at the far end, seated on a throne of black stone that seemed to absorb light, was Palpatine himself. The Emperor was ancient, his face ravaged by decades of channeling dark side energies, but his eyes held clarity and intelligence that spoke of a mind unclouded by age or sentiment. Beside him stood Darth Vader, silent and terrible, a warning rendered in armor and cape. Palpatine's voice was deceptively gentle when he spoke, like a grandfather offering wisdom to grandchildren who had strayed. Cara Zor-El, Luke Skywalker, welcome. I have been most eager to make your acquaintance. Cara felt the Force move around them, felt the Emperor's attention like physical touch, invasive and thorough, reading her intentions and responses with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime studying minds and breaking wills. You wish to understand what the Empire offers before committing to rebellion's futile cause. Wise, most wise. Let me show you what true order looks like. He gestured, and the throne room's walls became transparent, revealing Coruscant's cityscape stretching to every horizon. Trillions of beings living in peace because there is authority sufficient to maintain that peace. No more clone wars, no more separatist aggression, no more chaos masquerading as democracy, just order, efficiency, and the recognition that most beings require direction rather than freedom. You mean control, Cara said quietly. Fear, masquerading as peace. Palpatine's smile was indulgent. You speak of fear as though it were inherently negative, but fear is merely recognition of consequences. A child fears fire and thus does not burn itself. Citizens fear punishment and thus do not descend into anarchy. Fear is civilization's foundation, the acknowledgement that choices have costs and that some authority must enforce those costs. And what gives you the right to be that authority? Strength, skill, the willingness to do what others will not. I have guided this galaxy from the edge of destruction to the beginning of a golden age. In another generation, war will be memory and order will be so complete that planets will forget they once had choice in their governance. That is my gift to the future, purchased with blood and fear, and the understanding that suffering now prevents greater suffering later. Luke spoke for the first time since entering the throne room, his voice steady despite the darkness pressing against them. You're lying. The Empire doesn't prevent suffering, it causes it. Slavery, genocide, the destruction of entire worlds. That's not order, that's tyranny. Palpatine's attention shifted to Luke with sudden intensity. Ah, young Skywalker, so much like your father in passion and certainty. Anakin believed as you do, once. Believed that individual moral judgment was superior to pragmatic necessity. But I taught him the truth. I showed him that power wielded decisively accomplishes more than principle maintained stubbornly. Join me, and I will show you the same truth. Together, father and son can rule this galaxy with wisdom no single person could achieve alone. Luke's hand moved toward where his lightsaber would have been if he had been permitted to carry it, a reflexive gesture of rejection. I will never join you. I will never become what my father became. Won't you? Palpatine's voice dropped into registers that resonated with dark side energy, and Cara felt the Force convulse around them. Your father stands beside me, the most powerful servant I have ever trained. He has offered you the chance to rule at his side, to restore the Skywalker bloodline to its proper place of dominance. Refuse, and I will kill you and conscript Cara Zor-El into service through methods that make voluntary cooperation seem compassionate by comparison. Vader stepped forward, his mechanical breathing filling the silence. Luke, this is your last chance. Join us or die. Those are your only options. I will not offer again. Cara positioned herself between Luke and the two Sith Lords, her body language declaring protection that her power could enforce. You're not taking either of us. I came here to understand what the Empire represents. I understand now. You're afraid, both of you. Afraid that if people have choice, they'll choose something other than your vision. Afraid that order maintained through fear will eventually collapse. So you try to lock the galaxy in place to prevent change through overwhelming force. But that's not strength. That's weakness, disguised as conviction. Palpatine's expression shifted, amusement giving way to something colder. Such courage. Such righteousness. You remind me of the Jedi in their final days, standing on principle while the galaxy burned around them. Very well. If you will not join willingly, I will demonstrate what happens to those who mistake compassion for power. He raised both hands and lightning erupted from his fingertips, not the blue-white electricity of storm clouds, but something darker, corrupted, energy that carried the weight of suffering and death. It struck Kara with force that drove her to her knees, pain beyond anything she had experienced in this galaxy, flooding through her invulnerable body as though the lightning was attacking not flesh but soul. She screamed, and Luke moved to help her, but Vader intercepted him, lightsaber igniting to block the young Jedi's path. "This is your lesson," Vader said, his voice carrying regret so faint it might have been imagined. "Power without submission to greater power is punished. Watch what happens to those who resist." Luke fought with everything Yoda and Ben had taught him, with technique and determination, and the Force flowing through him in patterns of light that pushed back against the throne room's darkness. But Vader was stronger, more experienced, and he drove Luke back with methodical precision while the Emperor continued to torture Kara with lightning that should have killed her but somehow didn't, sustained at levels designed to extract maximum suffering without allowing unconsciousness or death. Kara tried to resist, tried to push back with Force techniques she had learned. But the pain was overwhelming, dissolving thought and will into pure anguish. She could feel the Emperor's presence in the attack, his consciousness riding the lightning, probing for weaknesses and vulnerabilities that his will could exploit. And then, impossibly, she felt something else. The Force was responding to her pain, not with the amplification that had characterized her presence, but with something more directed. It was flowing into her, through her, seeking to fill the space the lightning was carving out of her essence, and in that flow she felt connections extending outward through the galaxy. To Leia on Home One, to the rebel soldiers fighting on a dozen worlds, to the slaves in imperial factories and the prisoners in detention centers, and every being who had ever looked at injustice and thought that someone, anyone, might challenge the order that crushed them. They were lending her their hope, their determination, their will to resist, and the Force was channeling it into strength that was not merely personal but collective. Kara stood despite the lightning, despite the agony, and when she looked at Palpatine, her eyes were glowing with light that had nothing to do with Kryptonian biology and everything to do with the Force flowing through her in patterns that the Emperor had not anticipated. "You're wrong," she said through gritted teeth. "Power doesn't come from domination, it comes from connection, from choosing to stand with others instead of above them. And that's why you'll lose, not because we're stronger, because we're willing to be weak together." She reached out through the Force, not to attack, but to call, and the connections she felt crystallized into something tangible. On ships throughout the Imperial fleet, Force-sensitive beings who had been hiding their nature felt her presence and understood that they were not alone. On planets under occupation, resistance cells received sudden certainty that their struggle mattered. In detention centers, prisoners gained strength to endure one more day. The Emperor's lightning intensified, became killing rather than merely torturous, and Kara felt her body beginning to fail under the assault. But before the attack could finish her, before Palpatine could extract the victory he had orchestrated, the throne room exploded inward, not from external assault, but from internal betrayal. Darth Vader, who had been fighting Luke with mechanical precision, suddenly turned and plunged his lightsaber into the Emperor's back. The lightning stopped. The throne room went silent except for Palpatine's scream of rage and pain. And Vader, who had been the Empire's most loyal servant for decades, spoke in a voice that carried both mechanical distortion and genuine emotion. "No, not my son. Never my son." Palpatine spun, his own lightsaber igniting in a blur of motion, and struck at Vader with fury that made his earlier torture seem gentle. But Vader stood his ground, accepting wounds that would have killed a normal being, defending Luke and Kara with the last reserves of strength remaining in his damaged body. "Traitor!" Palpatine shrieked. "I made you. I saved you. Everything you are, you owe to me." "No," Vader responded, his voice growing weaker as the Emperor's attacks found critical systems. "Everything I was, you destroyed. But what I am now, what I choose in this moment, that is mine alone." Luke rushed to his father's side, supporting the massive frame as it began to collapse. Kara, recovering from the lightning assault, moved to position herself between them and the Emperor, ready to continue fighting despite exhaustion that made every movement agony. But Palpatine did not press the attack. Instead, he studied them with eyes that held calculation rather than rage, assessing whether victory here was worth the cost it would extract. "You have won nothing," he said finally, his voice returning to that deceptive gentleness. "Vader's betrayal changes nothing. The Empire remains. Order remains. And you, all of you, will be hunted to the edges of the galaxy and beyond." He gestured, and Imperial guards flooded the throne room, weapons ready, but Palpatine raised a hand to forestall their attack. "Let them leave. Let them carry the broken traitor and the girl who thought compassion could defeat conviction. Let them tell the rebellion what happened here, and let that knowledge demoralize them. They have gained one damaged cyborg and lost any hope of my mercy. That is a poor trade." Kara did not understand the calculation behind the Emperor's restraint, but she was not foolish enough to question it. She helped Luke support Vader's weight, and together they retreated from the throne room, through corridors that seemed longer now, past stormtroopers who watched but did not intervene per the Emperor's command. They reached their shuttle and departed Coruscant with no pursuit, flying into the darkness between stars carrying a man who had been evil and chosen redemption in his final moments, who had sacrificed everything to save his son from the fate he himself had embraced. On the shuttle, as they fled toward rebel space, Vader's systems began failing. He removed his helmet with mechanical hands that shook, revealing a face ravaged by burns and sustained only through machinery and will. When he looked at Luke, his eyes held humanity that the mask had concealed. "You were right. Tell your sister. You were right about me." Luke was crying, holding his father's hand, and Kara understood she was witnessing something sacred, a redemption purchased with betrayal and blood, and the choice to prioritize love over loyalty to darkness. Vader, Anakin Skywalker as he had been and chose to be again in his final moments, died in his son's arms with the peace of someone who had finally found the path they had been seeking all along. They returned to the rebel fleet carrying a body and news that would reshape the war. The Emperor's most deadly servant had turned, had chosen light over dark in the moment that mattered most, and that choice reverberated through the Force with implications no one could fully predict. Mon Mothma received the news with expressions that cycled through shock, hope, and strategic calculation. Vader's death will destabilize Imperial command structure. Palpatine relied on him to enforce order through fear. Without that enforcement, regional Moffs will begin competing for power. This is our opportunity. The rebellion moved with urgency born of hope, launching coordinated strikes across the galaxy, targeting infrastructure and command centers, while Imperial forces struggled to maintain coherence without Vader's unifying presence. And Kara and Luke fought beside them, two beings who had learned that power mattered less than the choices that directed it, that strength without compassion was merely cruelty, and that the galaxy's fate would not be decided by overwhelming force, but by millions of small choices made by ordinary beings who decided that freedom was worth fighting for. The war did not end quickly. The Empire was too vast, too entrenched, to collapse overnight, but it began to crack, fissures spreading through its structure as worlds rebelled and officers defected, and the certainty that had sustained Imperial rule gave way to doubt. Kara continued to fight, but differently than before. She learned to inspire rather than dominate, to support rebel forces rather than replace them, to use her power in ways that empowered others rather than making them dependent. She became a symbol, yes, but one that represented possibility rather than salvation. The idea that change was achievable through collective action rather than waiting for someone powerful enough to save you. And slowly, across years of continued struggle, the balance shifted. The Empire contracted, fragmented, became local tyrannies rather than galactic hegemony. The rebellion evolved into a new republic, imperfect and contentious, but offering choice where the Empire had offered only obedience. Kara never found her way back to Earth. The dimensional barriers that had allowed her entry into this galaxy did not reveal themselves again. And eventually she accepted that this was her home now. This was where the universe had placed her, and that perhaps the accident that brought her here had been the Force's way of answering the galaxy's need for someone powerful enough to challenge tyranny, but wise enough to refuse dominion. She stood on a balcony overlooking Coruscant, now freed and beginning the long process of healing from decades of Imperial rule, and watched the sun set over a city that was learning to dream again. Beside her, Leia spoke quietly. "Do you regret it? Staying here instead of searching for a way home?" Kara considered the question honestly. "Sometimes, but I think I've learned something important. Home isn't a place, it's a commitment. I committed to helping this galaxy, and in making that commitment, I made it my home. Not because I had to, because I chose to." Leia smiled, the expression carrying weight of shared history and mutual respect. "The galaxy is fortunate you made that choice, though I suspect it would have happened regardless. The Force has a way of ensuring people end up where they're needed most. Maybe, or maybe I just got lucky crashing in a place where I could actually make a difference. That's not luck, that's destiny choosing well." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city transform from daylight brilliance to evening glow, and in that moment Kara understood that she had found something on this alien world that she had been searching for on Earth. Not acceptance of her difference, but acceptance of her sameness. She was no longer the last daughter of Krypton, set apart by loss and power. She was simply Kara, a being who had chosen to stand with others against darkness, and in that choice had found purpose larger than any individual destiny. The Force flowed through her still, amplified and chaotic, but she had learned to channel it toward creation rather than destruction, toward hope rather than fear. And in learning that lesson, she had helped teach a galaxy that power mattered less than the purposes it served, and that true strength lay not in dominating others but in standing beside them. The war was not over. It would never truly be over. But the balance had shifted, and the galaxy had been reminded that tyranny could be challenged, that empires could fall, and that hope, sustained through collective action and shared sacrifice, was the most powerful force in the universe. Kara Zor-El, the girl of steel who had crossed dimensional barriers to crash into a galaxy at war, had become something more than hero or savior. She had become a reminder, a living symbol that power without compassion was merely strength, but power directed by love and guided by community was transformation itself. And in a galaxy still learning what freedom meant, still struggling to define justice without tyranny or chaos, that reminder was worth more than any amount of invulnerable strength or flight, or the ability to punch through starship hulls. It was worth everything.